Welcome back. So last time, we took a survey of both the well-known and unknown innovators of the avant-garde music that was being made in the 60s. Now, I've mentioned this a few times by now, but I did the initial research that became these videos a few years ago. And in the transition from page to screen, I've been doing a whole new crop of research, one that's turned up a ton of new information. So before we continue on in our jazz history and historiography timeline, I want to take a look at a few artists I either mentioned only in passing or skipped over entirely. Our story, as it were, begins in 1962. A newly radicalized Cecil Taylor was leading his self-titled group, the Cecil Taylor Unit, and a number of significant artists of the idiom had played with him. Jimmy Lyons, Ronald Shannon Jackson, but uncredited among its ranks at the time was a then lesser-known saxophonist named Albert Ayler. And by now we've talked enough about the musical environment he existed in to start to notice some recurring themes in his story. The first is debunking the then popular notion that the free school was comprised entirely of players who couldn't play normally, when in reality Albert Ayler was something of a prodigy. He played in blues, R&B, and jazz groups through his teen years into his early adulthood, with such a command over the language that the locals compared him to Bird himself. 2, like so many defects from bop to avant-garde, he had something of an awakening. The end result of which was the belief that the only way forward, the only way to play that hadn't already been explored to the fullest of its potential, was the avant-garde, a la Coltrane. 3, Ayler's sense of self and how he perceived the world were tied to his music making, wherein through his playing he was seeking a higher spiritual truth. These are his words, taken straight from his documentary. "My imagination is beyond the civilization in which we live. I believe I am the prophet." Now who, pray tell, does that sound like? And 4, beyond not being interested in classifying what he was doing, Ayler seemed to deliberately try to defy categorization, even within the purposefully nebulous realm of the avant-garde. Like in the last video, I described Coltrane as the great unifier on the conceptual level, representing the perfect cross-section of bop and free ideas of the time. But Ayler's playing was equally multidisciplinary, maybe even more, depending on who you ask. One second it'd be the slip-slide approach of Ornette, the next it'd be a wailing, soulful, James Brown-esque blues rasp, the next a jubilant New Orleans mourners march. Maybe more so than anybody else, Ayler represented taking the horn to the fullest possibilities of sounding like the human voice. Was he trying to harken back to jazz's New Orleans roots? Was he trying to push in a more spiritual Coltrane-esque direction? Was he trying to bridge the language of the bop and free periods the same way Coltrane had done? The more important question is, why try to pigeonhole what he was doing at all? Now, during his time playing in the Army Band, Ayler actually crossed paths with another musician who'd prove auspicious to the new music movement, Roscoe Mitchell. As one of the co-founders of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, he was an enormous influence in larger ensemble-based free music, and he carried that spirit with him into the establishment of the Creative Arts Collective, which he co-founded with the guitarist Spencer Barefield. Barefield's the one leading the group today, so check out his site if you want to know more. But as ubiquitous as the influence of the AACM and its various offshoots was, what if I told you that there was another avant-garde ensemble that actually came first? And with that said, let's talk about somebody I bet y'all really don't know, Horace Tapscott, yet another talented bop artist who defected into the avant-garde. Now, Tapscott played with Lionel Hampton, so you know he was the real deal. And in 1961, he'd leave that group to form his own Pan-African People's Orchestra. Yes, spelled the same way as Sun Ra, a full 4 years before the creation of the AACM. Note that depending on the exact window of time you're looking at, their name will vary greatly. The orchestra came first, then the Underground Musicians Association, then the Union of God's Musician and Artists Ascension. This was a rebranding of the UGMA, but was also a heading that the orchestra collectively fell under. Either way, the mission was always about the preservation of black music on the whole, a term that Tapscott, unsurprisingly, like many of his contemporaries, preferred over jazz. Now, the UGMAA was interesting in that it wasn't just about music. It included visual artists and dancers too. This was a strategy that caught on with some other ensembles like the Black Artists Group. This group was dedicated to multimedia presentation that wove music, theater, dance, visual arts, poetry, and even film all together as one. The common thread, of course, being black art. However, and rather uniquely among these kind of collectives, these largely St. Louis-originated musicians were open to the influence of European art music, a body of work that many avant-garde musicians were very adamant about distancing themselves from, particularly Igor Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg. Though, if you're familiar with either of those guys, this shouldn't come as a surprise. And since the BAG had a very short career, flourishing for about 4 to 5 years in the late 60s into the early 70s, you'll unfortunately be hard-pressed to find anything about them other than retrospectives about how unique they were. And on the topic of obscurity and short-lived careers, let's come back to Ayler for a second, whose own niche status has to do with his unfortunately short life, which ended with an assumed suicide when he was just 35. This came on the heels of him moving away from his avant-garde stylings and more towards R&B and rock-influenced music in the late 60s, a shift largely due to pressures from Impulse, whom Coltrane, their golden boy at the time, had convinced Ayler to sign to. Now, there's no official stated cause, no letter that we can look at, but I'll tell you what I think, and I'll tell you the conclusion that a lot of you are probably coming to as you're hearing this. I think he felt trapped and stifled. I think he felt like his artistry was compromised. I think he felt like it was the only way out. And this tragic story, much like the man himself, is very telling, because it was an unbelievably apt herald and analogy for what was going to come next in jazz. The effects of the new music were initially ambivalent. Whether or not the ideological goal had been met was not pertinent in the moment, although the music had undoubtedly created an underground soundtrack for the time. Now, there were a lot of critics like George Russell or Stanley Dance who decried the music as having been ultimately destructive to the jazz community. And from a certain perspective, they had a point. Hear me out on this. This isn't going where you think it is. Now, while new musicians were tearing away the traditions of the music, many mainstream players accused them of only doing so because they were incapable of playing real jazz. A point we just debunked a couple of times, but whatever. Which interestingly was a perspective shared by Thelonious Monk of all people, who, as we talked about, was in many ways a forebear to the sound of the 60s. And this ever-widening divide was only exacerbated by critics who used all manner of labels to misinterpret the music and pit the sides against one another. All the while, jazz as a genre steadily lost its support base, and mainstream players were very quick to point the finger. Now, while the new musicians resented traditionalists for being trapped, mainstream players, a lot of them, felt like this new stuff was straight up disrespectful to the craft that they had worked so hard to perfect. Not to mention that the abstract nature of the music only drove off people who wanted easy listening. The schism that you've heard me mention a few times now was now fully complete. The 60s had divided the jazz community. But to interpret this as a unilaterally bad thing would be to suggest that a monolithic community is, in any situation, the correct or desirable thing. No, every type of music, every type of art, every type of society has always tended towards plurality. We are human, and so we are different, and so we create differently. And perhaps appropriately, in the 70s, plurality would become the music's most powerful tool. Now, it's impossible to talk about fusion without talking about the other tract of music that helped to birth it, not just in terms of sound, but in terms of the circumstance of the decade, and therefore, the motivation: rock. In truth, while the blame often got piled onto the avant-garde, it really was rock and the crazy astronomical sales numbers it was putting up that cast jazz into the dark for good. The exact wording has varied, but many musicians and critics championing mainstream jazz, which at this point was beginning to solidify as its own school of thought, spoke of rock and the British invasion as someone coming to kill jazz, which is extreme, especially when you consider that these musicians were obviously indebted to black music. To give a brief history without getting too into the weeds of rock and roll, because that's not what this video is about, rock and roll took Britain by storm in the late 1950s. And like jazz, the immediate scene was one of admiration and imitation. But by the 1960s, the British musicians, who had armed themselves with guitars and amps, would start to put their own spin on the black music that they were so taken with, mostly R&B and the blues. Undoubtedly, the primary exponents of the early British wave of rock were the Beatles. It's been written about a million times, but many attribute the shift in the popular music climate to them specifically, particularly with the undeniably seminal record Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club. Quick disclaimer before we go on. I'm not saying you shouldn't like rock, I'm not saying it's not good, none of that stuff. All I'm doing is explaining the circumstances and attitudes of the time that led to the beliefs that these people held. Now, a lot of people saw Sgt. Pepper as an elevation of rock music. But ironically, the way it elevated rock music was through its use of more traditionally European concert idioms. And here, of course, we can start to see those old patterns of resentment around racial politics as it pertains to music cropping up once again. Because the success of Lonely Hearts, to many musicians, reflected the sentiment of Eurocentric or white sounds being necessary for the elevation of black art. Now remember, we've talked about this already. Paul Whiteman, George Gershwin, even the rightfully celebrated William Grant Still, they had all experimented with this notion decades earlier. It also provides another powerful example of the commodification of black sounds into white sound worlds, which is something we talked about last time, where they became far more successful than they were in the hands of their creators. And you might say to yourself, well, art being made by cultures other than the one it originated from is not automatically commodification. And you're 100% correct, it's not. But when the original culture is intentionally and maliciously excluded from the greater visibility and profits, especially while facing everyday legalized domestic discrimination, that qualifies as commodification to me, and I'd think to most people. This was a central crux of a lot of the thought surrounding rock and fusion, both back then and today. Notable producer and engineer of the time, David Rubinson, defined fusion as black music being played, sometimes inauthentically, by white people. But to set aside the racial politics of the time and look a little more objectively at things, this more progressive rock, prog rock, was, like jazz, a combination of style. Black American blues, electronics, European concert idioms and art forms. So in a different way, this music was kind of a fusion of its own. Now, nobody called it that, but I say that to say that we're reaching a point in the history where labels are about to get extremely arbitrary. Fusion history in most treatments refers to a desperate scrambling attempt by members of the jazz mainstream to recapture their audience by fusing their music with rock and therefore pop. Hence why some people throw around the term jazz rock that you'll see. Though it should be noted that that term's a bit of a misnomer, because contrary to a lot of popular retrospectives on this period, much of this music was very rooted tangibly and provably in the soul and funk of the decade prior. Now, if you ask me, this narrative of excluding the importance of funk and soul specifically probably exists as a byproduct of the resentment and singular animosity that much of the jazz community held towards rock in particular, being more popular in the American consciousness compared to funk and soul. Not to mention that the most visible faces of one genre were white, and the other were black. Not to mention that to give proper credence to the influence of funk and soul and fusion music would mean to acknowledge that fusion isn't nearly as much of an exercise in commodification as some people claim. And to take it even further than that, though, take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, because I can't find any concrete evidence of this. A lot of critics feel that the major funk and soul acts of the 70s were directly inspired by some of the major players of the avant-garde, specifically Sun Ra. The Egyptian aesthetics, the stage rituals, the elaborate costumes, he'd done all of it first. So in spite of rock's popularity and the avant-garde's unpopularity, it's not like black folks weren't involved in the popular sphere of music. It just wasn't jazz on top anymore. But we're going to find that the further into jazz history we get, the more important nomenclature becomes to some people. So now that we've talked about the times, let's get into the particulars. The jazz historian Grover Sales says this about fusion. Some bored rock artists had been gravitating towards jazz, while some jazz players dallied with rock to recapture their dwindling audience. And if this overview seems uncharitable to you, guess what? Many historians write about jazz's genre-bending experiment with the exact same level of disdain, if not more. Let's be frank here, fusion gets a horrendous reputation in most jazz history treatments, if it gets a reputation at all. But I doubt that most of the critics spurning it, and the historians glossing over it, even knew the larger implications of their disapproval. It's generally regarded as a passé trend that died out as quickly as it began, which had little musical worth and no impact in the broader world of jazz. It is unfortunately true that many jazz musicians were pushed into fusion, or at least the incorporation of pop and rock elements, driven by record labels and the pressure to sell. And we've talked about how Ayler was affected personally by this, but even bigger names like Ellington, Basie, and Woody Herman got bullied too. And herein exists the dichotomy of fusion music. On the one hand, here's this style of music that benefits like no style before from complete freedom, lack of restriction, incorporate anything from any style you want from throughout history and across the world. But on the other hand, even after the new music efforts of the 60s to push away from the word jazz, that was still the word these musicians were being labeled with. A word which now had unprofitable and old-fashioned reputations to record companies. Stephen Pond writes this: "On this point at least, they, being fusion and avant-garde musicians, agree with Marsalis. It's the critics, rather than these musicians, who insist that their music is jazz. Where they disagree is regarding the amount of reverence and fixity awarded the term. To these musicians, jazz as a category confines them to a second-tier artistic status, too pretentious to be popularly relevant, but too populist for the European elite. The problem to them is that restricting themselves to jazz not only confines them stylistically, but also exposes their music to the charge of being merely jazz, described as such because of their music's focus on improvisation, and therefore not easily analyzable in ways acceptable to the Art Music Academy." Now this was vindicating for me to read, because this is the point at which I realized that when you get into historiography, as I did, as all these other writers did, you end up arriving at the exact same conclusions about the relationship between art, artist, and criticism, which is something we have talked about on this channel before, and we probably will again soon. So if you're worried I'm just talking out of my ass on these videos, worry no longer. I'm checking my work against everybody else's. Now, inevitably, jazz musicians had to fight this perception of their genre, and that of course resulted in some being pushed into creating music that they didn't really want to make. And the whole situation was really only made worse with pronouncements like "jazz as we know it is dead" in Downbeat, which of course led critics like the infamous Stanley Crouch to dismiss albums like Bitches Brew as the path of the sellout, even going so far as to assert that Miles Davis was betraying his race. In this way, there were many on both sides of the equation, critics and musicians, who defined this struggle between classic jazz and this new fusion, and by extension rock and roll, along racial lines. See everything we've talked about up until now to understand why that's silly. Now, to be fair, racial politics were undeniably an aspect of the divide, especially since this rock music that many jazz people were vilifying was born in the US primarily by black musicians, and was only now, with an influx of more marketable white faces, achieving mainstream popularity. This is of course a cycle that we've talked about happening again and again and again. But to view this music exclusively along those lines would be folly, since many musicians drew inspiration from the world abroad too. These issues call into light some interesting discussions about our initial debate, the sound of something versus the intent behind it. For many people, fusion was the inverse of the new music. Its sound was extremely pleasing, sometimes overly so, but the intent wasn't always there. Now remember, we talked about sincerity and preparation as having been the important things in the music of the decade prior. Those two things were not always there in the 70s. It was an evolution of the music, yeah, but, and this is the big significant difference with fusion and everything else, unlike all the styles we've talked about up to this point, including the avant-garde, it wasn't a natural evolution that musicians did because they wanted to. It was a forced evolution that musicians did because they felt like they had to. And in this way, the invasion of British rock on the Black American musical sphere was a profound disruption of the natural order. No matter how much potential fusion had, a lot of musicians were unable to shake their revulsion at the initial monetary incentive that had jump-started it. But it wasn't all bad, because as we'll see, even if it started off as a music intended to garner popularity and pay bills, it would eventually become both the counterpart to and the vindication of all of the efforts of the new musicians a decade prior. As idealistically opposed as these two decades currently seem to be, there were a lot of artists that carried over between them. Ayler himself was producing works blending pop, rock, and R&B with his own trademark brand of free playing, although unfortunately he was compelled to do so. But probably the most prolific and versatile of these crossovers had to be the horn player Tony Braxton, who played with many artists through the 60s and 70s. He recorded with the free visionaries like Leo Smith and Mahal Richard Abrams, but then he also went on to play with fellow crossover visionary Chick Corea, another personal idol of mine who we'll talk about later, in the group Circle, who put out some really cool recordings. All this is to say, fusion did not have the hard, sudden start that many critics say that it did. Regardless, the start of fusion is often marked in 1970 with the Miles Davis album Bitches Brew, which had a lineup of musicians who would become foundational to this new music, like Joe Zawinul and Chick Corea. It's also worth noting, a lot of what we're going to talk about here, those of you who are into jazz probably have heard of. Since fusion was specifically created for a bigger marketing push and to bring more people into jazz, there's a lot more documentation and public visibility of these people than the people we've talked about up until this point. Now, to place Bitches Brew as the start is fair, but even before that, the music world was experimenting with the sound of a jazz-rock hybrid. And we forget this because a lot of history treatments act like this decade was an abomination, but a lot of critics did feel that fusion was the next necessary step in the evolution of jazz. Take Cream in 1967, for example. Their American tour so delicately bridged these two worlds that people were unsure what to call them. Another one, Soft Machine, they actually swung in a lot of their performances. And for this reason alone, a lot of people actually did declare them a jazz band. So when Miles finally recorded and released his seminal fusion album, the difference was less about the sonic landscape for most people, and more about the name behind it. Miles had not been the first to hybridize the styles, but he was the first major jazz musician to do so. You see? And because he was the first major name to do it, Bitches Brew took on the importance of being the foundational jazz rock record. And here, as always, we see the power of nomenclature. And if you've been paying attention so far, you'll notice two layers of irony here. One, it was this obsession with nomenclature that primarily fueled jazz mainstream's disdain with fusion. And two, and this is an incredibly interesting thought experiment that I never see anybody talk about. So if this idea gains traction, you heard it here first. The existence of bands like Cream and Soft Machine proves that, had jazz been left to evolve on its own, jazz rock probably would have happened anyway. One can only wonder how differently fusion would be viewed today if it had been an organic progression, as all other jazz subgenres were. But alas, we live in this timeline. And having now bridged the dichotomy of the 60s and the 70s, tune in next time and we'll take a look at the sometimes misguided, often exciting, and always controversial stylings of some of fusion's main people.